What's going on YouTube? Welcome back to the channel. Today we're talking exposure and how you can master it if you're an absolute beginner. So grab a seat, grab a drink, and let's get into it. Okay, this video is going to consist of two parts. The first part is going to be the three main components that make up your exposure. The second part is going to be how you can use that to nail your exposure. And at the end of the video, I'm going to be sharing a tip about a mistake I used to make all the time and how you can avoid it. So without further ado, let's get right into it. So it's three main components that make up your exposure. That's going to be aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. Let's start with aperture. Aperture refers to the opening in the lens and measures the amount of light that is let through the lens and is able to hit the sensor. These are usually measured in f-stop. Some higher end cinema lenses use t-stops, but your normal everyday lens is going to use an f-stop. Now, the lower the number is, for example, f1.8, the wider open your lens is, the more light is going to pass through it and hit the sensor. And vice versa, the higher the number is, f22 for example, the smaller that opening is going to be and less light is going to be able to travel through it and hit the sensor. Which means the lower your f-stop, the brighter your image is going to be. The higher the f-stop, the darker your image is going to be. But this also affects your depth of field. The lower the f-stop number, again, f1.8 for example, the shallower your depth of field is going to be, which means your subject is going to be sharp, but your whole background is going to be blurry. And again, vice versa, the higher your f-stop is going to be, f22 for example, the deeper your depth of field is going to be, which means you're going to get more in your image that's going to be sharp. So you would usually use a lower f-stop number if you're doing something like portrait shots, where you have a main subject and you want everything else to be out of focus, and you want to shift your viewer's eyes onto that main subject. That's when you would use a lower f-stop number. The higher f-stop numbers you would use for something like landscapes because you have a lot more in focus because you want to capture the whole scene and the whole depth of the landscape. So you would use a higher f-stop number. Moving on to shutter speed. This refers to the amount of time the shutter is left open, allowing light to hit the sensor. And with shutter speed, it's the same principle. The higher the number, like 1/1000th of a second, the darker your image is going to be. The lower the number, like 1/5 of a second, the brighter your image is going to be. But this also affects your motion blur. So if you're shooting something really fast paced, like sports, cars, you're going to want a higher shutter speed to capture all that motion and make sure everything is tack sharp. While lower shutter speeds capture more motion blur into your image, meaning that if you're shooting a car going 30 miles an hour, you're going to see the car moving in the image. It won't be a sharp image of the car. So like I said, higher shutter speeds, more for action photography, sports, stuff like that. You can use lower shutter speeds while shooting landscapes and stuff where you don't really have a lot of motion blur, allowing you to capture the whole scene. The third component to exposure is ISO. Your ISO refers to the sensor's sensitivity to light. The higher the ISO, the more sensitive your sensor is going to be, and the brighter your image is going to be. The lower the ISO, the less sensitive your sensor is going to be, and the darker your image is going to be. But ISO also affects your image quality. ISO introduces digital noise into the image, the higher the ISO is. Meaning the lower your ISO, the sharper your image is going to get, the cleaner your image is going to get, and the higher your ISO, the more little dots like film grain and noise is going to be introduced into your image. Now, if you do have a lot of noise in your image, you can salvage this in your editing program. Lightroom has a amazing AI noise reduction built into it. But if you push it way too far, there's going to be a point eventually where you can get the noise out of the image, but it's just going to look super soft and there's not going to be any sharp edges or anything in the image, and it won't really look good. Now, obviously, if you're shooting out in broad daylight with the sun out and everything, you're going to want your ISO as low as possible to get the cleanest, sharpest image you can. And if you're shooting at night, you're going to have to push your ISO up higher to get a properly exposed image. Okay, so we covered the three components making up exposure, but how do you nail exposure in your camera? Most people will tell you to use your exposure meter. It's going to be a meter at the bottom of your LCD screen made up of a bunch of lines with numbers 321, -321, and a 0 in the middle. What they mean by that is you ideally want that meter to be exactly in the middle for a properly exposed image. I don't really like to use that method. The reason why, if you're shooting a subject outside, that metering is based off the subject. And 9 times out of 10, the camera won't take into consideration that the sky is a lot brighter than your subject, meaning that it's going to blow out the sky, it's going to blow out the highlights, and you will not have any detail left in the highlights to recover. Plus, the camera doesn't take into consideration the creative direction that you want to go with the image. For example, if you're standing at the beach with a sunset in the background and you have a subject you want to shoot, the metering is probably going to be based off the subject. And the exposure you need in that scenario to properly expose the subject is going to leave the sunset way too overexposed. It's going to blow out the highlights. The sunset will not look good on the image. And you'll walk away thinking, what happened to my photo? The sunset looked amazing in real life and it looks like crap on my photo. That's the reason why. So what I like to do instead is underexpose the image by 1 to 2 stops. And again, using the sunset on the beach example, that's going to leave the sunset in the background properly exposed and looking good on the picture. Yes, at first, your subject is going to be way too dark for the image, but you could either leave it like that as a silhouette shot, which are amazing as well, or you could bring the image then into Lightroom, bring up the shadows of the image, properly exposing your subject again, and leaving you with an overall well-balanced image where the sunset looks great, the subject looks great, and you could just be happy with the image overall and what it looks like. Okay, so my tip or the mistake that I used to make all the time and I still sometimes make is don't be afraid to push your ISO. I cannot tell you how many pictures I did not end up getting because I didn't feel comfortable pushing my ISO to the limits that I needed to in that scenario. But the reality is these cameras nowadays have such good noise reduction. If you want to use that in camera already, I wouldn't recommend it. I'd use a noise reduction in Lightroom, but the cameras have such good noise reduction and Lightroom's noise reduction itself is so good nowadays that you can recover a lot of images that otherwise would have been lost. Here's an example of an image that I took in Bavaria before and after while we were going through this narrow ridge, basically walking through caves, and I don't need to tell you how dark it's going to get in caves. I took the image anyway because at least I could walk away saying I got the image and try to salvage it, which worked thanks to Lightroom's noise reduction, and if not, at least I tried. So moral of the story is take the image anyway, at least you can try to bring it into Lightroom then and salvage the image instead of walking away wishing you would have. And that brings us to the end of the video. Thanks for watching. I hope you learned something today. If you did, like the video, leave a comment, subscribe, and I'll see you next time.